And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to GeekWatch, a subsidiary of the monastery, the open bar of the internet. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me as always is my good brother here in the temple, the man of 1,000 runes, the CEO of Zadari Enterprises, and the bane of my fucking existence, good brother Xanatrix.
Remember, Zadari Enterprises does not endorse anyone being a fucking grognard all over the internet regarding very popular and well-made games that are going to be releasing soon. I'm looking at you, everyone bitching about Final Fantasy XVI. Don't worry, you're going to be voluntold into our R&D department soon.
Now, I do want to make something clear. We're going to be bashing a lot of entries in the sim racing genre, and a lot of the community within it. However, do not mistake this for some idea that I hate sim racing. What the focus here is a demonstration on how the sim racing subgenre of racing games is a perfect example of what happens when the designed by gospel mindset that Zan and I have ripped into over the years reaches a natural endpoint. Because let's say that I am frustrated with Formula 1 2022. Now, to be fair, with all of these games, I don't hate any of them, but there are problems that need to be addressed. And F1 2022 is beautiful to look at, is good to play when it's fun to play when it works. Key phrase here being when it works, because especially when you want to do multiplayer, it can get buggy. Really, really buggy. As in appearing and disappearing cars kind of buggy. Supposedly, I suppose according to certain people who want to volunteer, that the true racing experience is not in racing games but in simulators, i.e. the trying to claim that the Simcade is the virgin and the simulator is the Chad, which I think is more to justify the multi-$100 expense of a racing rig, which for the record I have no interest in setting up. One, because of space issues, and two, because if I'm going to be setting up that kind of a rig, I'd rather have it be something multi-purpose that I can use for a variety of games. This is also the same reason why I stopped using HOTAS when I was playing Mech Warrior, because the amount of games that I'm going to be using HOTAS for are so limited in the vastness of my library.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'd mostly use it for like flight games and a few other things. That's about it. When I've got 2,500 PC games in my library, just a setup for just a few games isn't going to cut it. If that was the only games if flight sims were the only games I played, maybe I could justify it, but that's not the case. So one might say, well, what about Automobilista? No, Automobilista can be just as buggy. Okay, what about Assetto Corsa? Buggy as hell, and you have the MTX issue. But no, the one you really should be going into is R Factor 2, because it supposedly has the best physics of any simulator. You have no idea how sick I am of hearing about physics.
Mm-hmm.
I would rather go back and listen to my physics professor for as sick as I am about people talking about physics in a driving game. However, R Factor 2 has some really, really, really busted AI. There was a clip of a Formula E race that somebody was doing that managed to cause a traffic jam that, if that had happened in a real race, everybody would be dead.
Instead of just clumped up in a giant piece of bullshit.
Since I shared that video with you, I would like you to could you do your best attempt at explaining what the fuck you saw?
Oh, sure, absolutely. I could use all of the nice flowery language that I tend to use when trying to describe a scene, but I'm going to call this sheer what the fuckery as the summary, and then I will expound upon that. What happens is, at one point, one of the AI drivers spins out, and other AI drivers start catching on the spun out AI driver right at I guess you could call it at a choke point just after a curve.
Yeah.
And they managed...
This was at Monaco, I should note.
Yes. And they managed to pin the spun out driver against a divider, one of the concrete dividers. And this starts to cause all the rest of the drivers to catch on each other into a giant mass of cars doing bug fuck all. Just getting stuck there until enough of the mass of cars are pointing in the same direction that they slowly, ever so slowly, begin moving down this choke point as one singular mass. Mind you, some of the cars that have gotten caught, including the originally spun out car, have been spun around by the continued impacts that now they are trying to accelerate against the rest of the fucking mass of cars, causing this mass to move like it's molasses. Eventually the player gets caught in this as well near the end of the clip, and we even see them go into first person mode trying to get the fuck out of this, and they can't. It is it is a sheer monument to the type of chaos one can only get from bug-fucked code.
Now, I do have to play I do have to play a little bit of devil's advocate. R Factor 2 does not have a very large staff. I think they've only got like 11 people, and they're all the way out in Brazil. Yet despite this, they tried to set up an esports thing. And not just any old esports, but a virtual version of 24-hour Le Mans. A race that, if you know anything about Le Mans, you know that is grueling as hell, even for real drivers.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, they also wanted to bring in professional drivers to handle some of the teams. One of them was Max Verstappen, who's basically kicking everybody's ass with Red Bull these days.
Yep.
And it wasn't until he publicly lambasted the thing where apparently people were like, "Yeah, R Factor 2 needs some work." Because he ended up getting the server that the race was on got would show up in the server browser for the game. So even though this is supposed to be a closed environment, it somehow wasn't. It was buggy as hell. There were disconnections out the ass. And Verstappen was like, "This was a fucking mess."
Mm-hmm.
And so then some might say, "What about iRacing? There's plenty of options in iRacing." Yeah, there are. Here's the problem. All of those options are DLCs, and they add up quick. Nobody does iRacing semi-casually. The only people who do it are the sweaty boys. Or the people who can... Because just getting a decent amount of tracks could run you like $300. A decent amount of tracks and cars.
Mm-hmm.
R Factor 2, you had the issue where getting a DLC, getting one of the... There are packages, but getting individual cars were $5 and tracks were $10.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have nearly the amount of people on multiplayer, because everyone kept telling me, "You shouldn't be playing R Factor 2 single player. You should be playing. It's built for multiplayer." There's barely anybody in multiplayer. If you look on Steam charts, it's not even going to crack 500.
Yeah. That's totally multiplayer. Totally.
And so then somebody might say, "Well, what about Gran Turismo? That's a classic." Gran Turismo is. Gran Turismo 7 managed to fuck up by replacing GT Live, which there was nothing wrong with these cafe playlists that were basically battle passes in all but name. And I don't know about any of you, but I am sick of battle pass drip feeds as a way to keep you playing.
Not only as a way to keep you playing, but as a way to try and coerce you into purchasing more of the other MTX that exist within a game because of that drip feed. It's a manipulation of people's perception of time.
Mm-hmm. And I could certainly do without it.
Absolutely. I think that it's I mean, it's probably no surprise to anyone from how much we say we hate mobile games. But I'm inherently against all of the fucking turning games into de facto casinos, like gacha games and other mobile prizes with MTXs and ways that they manipulate your perception of time and your perception of value versus effort as a way to addict you. I think they're highly immoral, completely unethical, and I am fully on the side of Belgium for banning things like loot boxes and other MTX from their from their entire country due to how it is essentially just gambling. You may be like, but that doesn't fit your standards of freedom of choice. I'm like, sometimes you have to consider nuance in all things, and this is one of those times. If if companies themselves cannot stop themselves from being shitheads, sometimes a regulatory force must. But I'm way off the rails.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Monk.
So there's also the fact that even with all of that, the actual driving has barely improved from its predecessor, and that's not even getting into say how Forza has actively degraded in quality over the years.
So much so that they decided to do Forza Horizon, which is much better in many different ways, but still has quite a few of the issues we've already talked about regarding in-game purchases.
Mm-hmm. And
gameplay's got nice though.
Given all this bitching I'm doing about sim racing, somebody might say, well, why don't you just do arcade racers? I already do that. Whether it be full on futuristic like Redout, whether it be something on the more grounded approach, like say Need for Speed, although I'm using grounded in a very loose term here.
Yeah, gotta love that speed breaker that totally exists in real life.
Mm-hmm. Or even the times where I am able to dip into the many games that are based around Initial D. I'm there for all of that.
How can we forget an extremely popular at one time arcade racing that had some ridiculous things you could do in Midnight Club?
Yeah, I loved me Midnight Club. I also loved Project Gotham.
Yes.
And
PGR was real good.
And of course, there's way too many Sega arcade racers for me to count that have a place in my heart. And
if we want to go full on classic, everybody has Daytona stuck in their head.
Yeah. One of the greatest game songs with nonsense lyrics.
Please, everybody, go look up the lyrics to that song. It is an experience.
Yeah, and of course there's the crazy stuff that I can see in stuff like Ballistic NG, which is akin to which is going to be akin to Wipeout and Redout. The difference is it has Steam Workshop support.
Or Anti-Gravitator, our resident F-Zero XP.
Yep. And stuff like Grip. Which is
Grip is so
good.
What
What if we did Racer, but on the ceiling? And the floor.
It's so good. It's just so fucking confusing sometimes. You gotta wrap your head around it just a little.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll see that in all of these things that we've quoted as good arcade games to play, arcade racing games to play, there's a single through line that is true to these things. They didn't confine themselves to what came before.
Yeah, and since I've brought that up, this is as good a time as any to explain what exactly we mean whenever we talk about design by gospel, and why that is a massive problem when it comes to game design.
Okay. I know that we've gone into it in detail in other places, but having it centralized here is definitely the best point. Design by gospel, for the short definition, is designing a game or any other piece of media and entertainment in a specific prescribed fashion simply because that game or piece of media has been designed in that fashion before. Tradition for tradition's sake. Mm-hmm. In a more expanded definition, this is a facet of, well, we have to design this way because it's what's expected due to whether it's the implication of the genre the media is from, whether it's the implication of maybe the media is part of a series and building upon the history of that series. They're like, well, this facet has to be in there just because it's always been in there. Again, I will refer to what I said at the very beginning of all of this. Final Fantasy XVI is very clearly not a turn-based RPG. Very clearly an action-based RPG. A really good action-based RPG. And there are plenty of people who are pissed off saying that it is not Final Fantasy because it is not turn-based. When what makes Final Fantasy has never actually been defined by being a turn-based game ever. Like, yes, it started turn-based because of hardware limitations. But as I've mentioned numerous times at this point, Hiroyuki Ito, the creator of the active time battle system, who created it to introduce real-time elements to Final Fantasy in a gradual procession so that the existing audience would not feel alienated, stated that he always predicted Final Fantasy would go live action. And you can see this in numerous other places. The big reason we're bringing this up for sim racing is, as Monk pointed out with all of his numerous examples, people say this thing has to be in sim racing because it's always been in sim racing. It's what it is what is expected of sim racing.
Yeah.
They are designing by a dogma, by gospel, instead of looking at the whole of their project and designing around the core concept in a way that supports the core concept. And we've mentioned the necessity of a core concept when it comes to designing any piece of media. Now you may say that also sounds like design by gospel, but having a core concept is more of an overview function rather than an actual piece of the game that exists simply because it's always existed. It's more of a writing structure than it is the actual gameplay mechanics. It's the idea, the core idea behind your media. And once you've found that idea, that identity, everything should serve to enhance and elevate that idea. And it should all work holistically. And for those of you who don't know what the word holistic means, it actually is kind of what it sounds like. When something is holistic, you are considering all of the parts as they interact with each other and the whole project. Mm-hmm. And when you design by gospel, that's actually ignoring a holistic approach. And that leads to shortfalls, gaps, and generally a lack of quality. And that is why design by gospel is bad.
And I should note that racing games are in a very bad spot. It has been, just to use one example, it has been almost 20 years since we've gotten a mainline Ridge Racer. Most of Sega's entries want to lean more into the kart racing end of things these days, because we haven't had anything like GT or Rally or obviously. I don't expect anything like Daytona anymore, because trying to get the license for that means dealing with NASCAR, and they're not as willing to play ball as they were in the past, mostly because they're too busy trying to get themselves out of a situation where the people they decided to play ball with suck. But I'm just desperate for one racing game in this simulating leaning genre that doesn't have a catch.
And unfortunately, I don't think you'll get that from bigger names. Of course, as we always say here, games not names, so that doesn't really affect us much.
That doesn't affect us, but like, okay, of the racing games that have been released in the past decade, these are the ones that have a party system. Forza Horizon 5, Dirt 5, Grid Legends, Need for Speed Unbound, Driver San Francisco. The ones that
That's
have
5 games.
Yeah, the ones that have matchmaking. Redout, Formula 1 2021, Forza Horizon, Dirt 5, Need for Speed Hot Pursuit Remastered, Gran Turismo 7, World Rally Championship, Driver San Francisco. As far as custom lobbies, there's a handful of some of the games that I mentioned do have that, but a lot of them don't have. But only 4 of them, only 4 of the racing games that have come out in the last decade have bots. Forza Horizon, NASCAR Heat 5, Grid Legends, F1 2021. As far as custom presets, it's only Forza Horizon 5 and F1 2021. As far as online stability, it's only Assetto Corsa Competizione and iRacing. As far as career mode, plenty of them have it, but only 2 have a career mode that isn't bare bones: World Rally Championship and F1 2021. As far as the story mode, a few of them have it, but in terms of one that has a story mode that isn't garbage, the only one is Driver San Francisco. Have I made my point here?
Yep.
Now, I should note that originally I thought Ballistic NG didn't have multiplayer bots. They added it in an update. And AMS2 has multiplayer bots. But the point is that every single racing game has some sort of catch. And as some of you know, whenever I try and recommend, whenever I consider whether or not I'm going to recommend a game, one of the big questions I have is how easy or difficult it is to recommend. If it is difficult, if there's the more asterisks, the harder it is for me to recommend a game.
We don't like catches. We don't like hidden surprises. We want the game to be what the game is, as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. And with a lot of within a lot of the entries that I've talked about here, I'm not asking for much. I am not somebody who's asking for a 10 out of 10 thing. I just want this genre to be not so far behind from the rest of the gaming landscape. To put an example of what I mean, it was a big damn deal when Project Cars 2 had custom lobbies. You know what else had custom lobbies? Halo 2 on the original Xbox. And just about every shooter throughout the early 2000s. And most decent shooters since have had some form of custom lobbies. Granted, some of the bigger names have decided to dial back on that for dumb reasons, but this is not a new. But it was treated as this brand new revelation when it really isn't. I'm expected to celebrate the bottom of the barrel, the bare minimum. I cannot do that.
The lowest common denominator.
Like, I remember when I remember when remember when it was a big when Wizards of the Coast tried to make a big deal out of them getting rid of the negative modifiers for races and acting like they somehow made some grand leap forward in their design.
Yeah.
And then I was like, congratulations, you undid something that you redid with this new edition. Because fourth edition didn't have that. It just had pick +2 between two ability scores. Pick one. And then then for 5e they decided to bring that back. So it's a case of I'm not celebrating you for doing the bare minimum. Uh, in the same vein, I remember when a lot of people were jumping for joy at Bravely Default being a turn-based FF like. Whoop-de-fucking do.
Bravely Default. There were so many other things to celebrate, such as the robust job system that took what FF5 had created and made it a masterpiece, or a really good and compelling cast of characters and great story, which is something we've generally come to expect from Final Fantasy. And make no mistake, technically Bravely Default is by itself a people are going to compare to Final Fantasy since they're both Square, just like people compare Octopath and Final Fantasy since they're both Square. These things made innovations on systems that had existed for literal decades at that point, and people just say, "Oh, it's turn-based, hooray!" Like, the fuck are you on?
I suppose a bigger example, and one that's more apropos, is people making a big deal about Call of Duty going back to World War II with COD World War II. Except I was far from impressed, and then they tried to make a big deal of we're getting rid of health regen. Except instead you have one of your squad mates hand you a med pack.
So it's health regen in all but name.
Yeah. And the key things with these is this idea of having such a low bar with celebration. And just because I am desperate for a sim racer without some catch does not mean I'm going to immediately celebrate when the bare minimum that is viewed as the standard in most other game genres is met, and nothing further from that.
Yeah.
That's what I'm getting at with this. Like all, and and there's a few reasons why this ends up being such a massive burr up my ass. So first things first is there's a lot of really bad priorities. And I'm going to be picking on R Factor 2 for this because it shows one really strong case. So, I mentioned before R Factor 2 has a very small team.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's actually 11, but I know it's tiny. It's a glorified indie studio.
Yeah.
So they decided to do a DLC pack on what they called their USA tour. The USA tour was going to focus on oval racing tracks, like say Indy, and do a bunch of liveries that you would see in open wheel racing, like IndyCar.
Mm.
Except it was very clear that the AI could not figure out oval racing, and yet they insisted on this for 11 months. Not only that, but promised it could barely handle one oval race. They wanted to put 4 tracks. One of them being Daytona. I can't remember what the other 2 was. One of them was Indy, one of them was Daytona. But four oval style races that the AI clearly can't seem to figure out. And
Which is weird, all things considered. Oval racing would be the simplest AI pathing ever.
I get the feeling it's because of the fact that it wasn't built with it in mind early on.
Probably.
It was built. A lot of the early iterations was stuff like GT and Formula. And
Yeah.
you don't see a whole lot of oval tracks in either of those formats.
No, they tend to have the longer, a little more complicated tracks.
Especially since a lot of in Formula 1, you have a lot of races that take place in cities.
Yeah.
And that's been a tradition for the longest time. In fact, it was a big damn deal when they were finally able to do a city race in Detroit for the first time in decades. And they had also promised 17 new cars. That is, for a team of that size, spending that amount of time on something that clearly wasn't working. You shouldn't have promised that kind of thing to begin with, for one. And two, I think that amount of time is better spent on refining the AI and the racing that you already do have, instead of adding to it and creating more and more bloat. As there's been this idea that if we're for these games that we have to be doing all of the F1 courses, all of the rally courses, all of the GT courses, and all of the cars and manufacturers within it. Even for large AAA level teams, that is excessive.
Yeah. One of the things that was both fun to see, but also not so fun to achieve, in something like Forza Horizon, they have a ton of cars from all around racing history, and unlocking them can be a lot of fun or very tedious, depending on which car it is. It's and that many cars. I forget how many cars Forza Horizon has at this point.
And keep in mind, for each one of those cars, you have to go through a painstaking process of getting the audio and getting the feel right for each of them.
Absolutely.
Because obviously, GT cars should not feel the same as say Formula 1.
Nor should either of those feel like rally cars.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is the realism thing. Now, the only reason the name simulator got used was to differentiate itself from kart racing, and the more arcadey stuff you would see with, say, Sega Rally or Daytona USA,
or older Need for Speed games like the Underground series,
or even Test Drive.
Yep.
And truth be told, I didn't really hear the term simulator until Gran Turismo. It's possible that it may have shown up beforehand, but I doubt it.
I'd say GT, while not the Patient Zero, is definitely the popular entry that started really causing the word racing sim to get out there.
Mm-hmm.
Because I will say this now. GT is actually not a racing sim. If we want to consider other genres of sims and what they are supposed to actually simulate, GT is not a racing simulator. I'm sure there are games out there that would fit that sim word, like how Microsoft Flight Sim is truly a flight sim.
Mm-hmm.
But GT is kind of halfway between simulationist and arcadish.
Which is where
Especially,
the term simcade comes from.
mhm. And it's really evident even with the earliest GTs how gamified and arcadey the many of the parts of the game come across, such as how you earn licenses and everything.
Hmm.
But
And sometimes sometimes the random car setup in some that you might unlock, which ends up being a massive fucking tease because you think you're gonna get something good and you end up getting another snot box.
yep.
But to to an example of this particular issue of trying to focus so much on realism. Uh, let's consider how the doing cell shaded smoke trails in Need for Speed Unbound was controversial.
You mean non-traversial.
Oh, definitely, and I think the reason for it, which to be fair, Need for Speed Unbound is actually pretty good. The only problem is it just doesn't have enough circuits to warrant dipping into it for a lengthy amount of times. But I look at people saying that the exaggerated cartoony smoke trails is somehow a step too far, and I'm like, this coming from the same franchise that double and triple dipped into import tuner culture for about 7 years with Underground 2, Most Wanted, and Carbon, and in addition to the glut of arcade racers that there were in the PS2 era, this is somehow offensive. Bitch, please.
Oh. It's like they forgot that Need for Speed has never really been simulationist. It's always been kind of campy and arcadey.
Yeah,
So
it and unfortunately when it comes to when it comes to a lot of the names that we had with Simcade, unless you're talking about the indies, Need for Speed is the only one that's still in the game.
hmm
Is We're not getting another Midnight Club because Rockstar is too busy making one game every millennium. Um,
and and fucking over existing games, like what they did when they removed over 200 cars from GTA Online recently.
mhm.
You
uh,
can't purchase them unless you have GTA Plus, and even then, some of them aren't even purchasable when you're a GTA Plus subscriber. Thanks, Rockstar, for proving you're just as bad as EA.
yeah, and um, when it comes to Capcom hasn't stepped into this area in decades. Um, I already mentioned the whole thing where most of the Ridge racers are relegated to arcades
Yeah,
in the last several years.
yeah. I think that's probably because Capcom realized that when it comes to their strengths for home entertainment, uh, it's not something for them to. Racing is not something that they seem to be adept at for home entertainment.
Hmm.
Because make no mistake, with Capcom's games that go to home entertainment, they're very well polished, very well done. Everybody knows Devil May Cry and Monster Hunter and a whole bunch of other things, Street Fighter, etc. So, 'cause, 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 '
even
And,
if you don't like some of the decisions they make regarding those games.
and as I mentioned before, the when it comes with a and it and then let's bring in Nintendo, who keeps claiming that the reason that they won't do another F-Zero is because they can't, because they haven't thought of a new idea with it. I'm like, you don't need a massively new idea. You just need to do doing F-Zero with the Switch's tech is all that people would be asking for. You don't need to have some brand spanking new gimmicky ass control setup. If anything, the last few years, whenever they've tried to do some sort of gimmicky interface, it always ends up outside of the Wii, it ends up blowing up in their face.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes for reasons of their own, and sometimes for outside reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's the people who then one particular thing that I hear a lot is it's impossible to do anything new with racing. That you're just racing, you're just doing laps. There's no way to innovate with that. Bullshit. 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 Bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of my favorite racing experiences on the PS2 was an arcade racer called Kinetica.
I love Kinetica. Holy shit, that game is so good.
And they talked within the design of Kinetica, they talked about wanting to have racing models that were far more animated. And because of the fact that it's in this sci-fi cyberpunk like setting, there's literally nothing you cannot do with it. Um, it's just as criminal that we haven't had a successor to XG3 in decades.
Mm-hmm.
And I am grateful for the likes of Redout, but the point is that in the name of realism, the focus so often is on things like how they're animating the tires, or how they're trying to replicate shifting, or even replicating the things that would only matter to professional drivers and the sweatiest of racing fans.
Yeah.
Whereas anybody outside of that group is going to look at say Forza Horizon 5 and say, I've been here before.
Mm-hmm.
But and the reason why I brought up the whole controversy with Unbound is that would not be a controversy if it weren't for the fact that everybody is trying to look the fucking same. This is the reason why the sim racing genre is a perfect example of what Design by Gospel brings you. This idea of, okay, we have to have the Nürburgring. We have to have these cars and these manufacturers. Even if we're not the official racing game of a given format. But we have to have all of that because reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas there's whole hosts of ideas that you could do. Like look at I recently came across a little 40K game called Speed Freaks, which is currently in develop. Although there's alpha footage out there.
Mm-hmm.
Some of my colleagues dismissed Speed Freaks and saying it's just a Twisted Metal ripoff. Maybe. However, when's the last time we had a Twisted Metal? like when I think like and you don't, and a lot of the stuff that you supposedly need in terms of this design by gospel, you really don't. Wreckfest has been doing very, very well for itself, and it doesn't have any of that. If anything, it feels like the unholy union between Burnout and Flatout. Flatout 3 notwithstanding, nobody talks about Flatout 3.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, you do have the full-on demo derby approach, but you also have standard races that are still doing the demo derby thing. Meaning because of that, there's nothing wrong with you driving far more aggressively, which is how I tend to drive anyways. I'm not going to try and drive safe until you're angry like Grid Legends. No, if I want to run somebody off the road, I'm going to run them off the road. There's a reason why Mario Kart is the game that ends friendships. Or depending on the friendship, I'd say reinforces them.
Yeah.
Because we've all made friends with somebody who we spend more time arguing and fighting with than anything else. Not that I'd know anything about that or anything.
No, not at all. I have no idea what he's talking about, people.
But then there was one collection of concept art, and I think I've shared with you this with you in the past. I'm gonna put this in council.
Okay.
These were concept arts by Gregory Formento, who works at Behavior Interactive, and there's a lot of potential. You could make a whole game based on this concept art that I'm showing you.
Yes.
And since I can't show it on stream, could you attempt to give the gist of what's being shown here?
So, from what we're seeing here, this is a futuristic world with very classic-looking cars in a way. Like, some of these look like cars from the 80s, but, they're being refueled by airships with some sort of fuel that is not obviously gasoline. Or they're in some cases racing over these really cool sprawling jungle areas or at least just going through a jungle area right outside of a sprawling city, like a jungle right outside a city. It's very, I would almost call this this reminds me of, in some ways, of I have to make the comparison to Night City, obviously, considering it's surrounded by desert and also by wilderness. And it has the futuristic streak to it, but it has very classic car looks. A lot of these, like a Mustang Shelby, a Sebring, an F40, the Ferrari 250 GTO. Some of these are very classic cars everybody knows the look of, but it's in a very futuristic setting with some really cool ideas behind that futuristic setting. And so it kind of looks like a little bit of Wasteland Warrior with some of the excessive modifications on these cars. A little bit of the cyberpunk future with the desert right next to the city. But it's really just future punk in general, with classic racing and classic car tendency.
Yeah. And since you brought up Night City, tell me you would not pay good money to see Cyberpunk 2077's vehicles in something akin to something akin to Need for Speed.
That'd be super fun. I'd love to do that, especially since the race
side quest in Cyberpunk 2077 leaves much to be desired, since, well, it's pretty easy to win the races.
Yeah, it's easy to win the races, but the point is a place like, and I have run campaigns with 2020 and Red, built around street racing culture.
Hmm.
And part of it was this was right around the time, in the case of 2020, this was right around the time Most Wanted was making waves, and I used that
Yeah,
as a con to get people playing.
yeah,
Because unlike some, I do not have a purism factor when it comes to games. If
yeah.
I will steal from films and weeb shit as much as I want if it means getting people playing.
Absolutely. But, all of this art is, I'm going to say this, gorgeous. Just a run of the cars. This guy like painted in all of this. We got a Mini Coupe. We've got the aforementioned Mustang Shelby Sebring F40 and 250 GTO. We've got a Lotus XG. I know that I said that wrong, but I don't give a shit. An old style Audi Quattro.
Yeah, I love Quattros.
Yeah. Lancia Stratos, the R5 Turbo, a Lancia Delta, an Abarth 131. We've got a couple of Beetles that actually look pretty good.
Yeah,
Classic ones.
although you will never get me in one of those fucking things.
You can never get me in one of those things. He's actually got two different Lancia Stratoses kitted out in different ways. An R5 Turbo Rally. Wow.
And there's because the setup with this kind of with these concepts is one where you could do just about anything. I can easily envision a race where you're going through portals that lead to different biomes.
Yeah. Those would be your checkpoints, actually.
Hmm.
Like, you go through a portal, and that's the checkpoint for, like, the old style timed arcade racers.
Yeah. Or if somebody or if I have to go with something a bit more ridiculous, I would pay good money to see a video game that draws upon one of the greatest racing anime movies to ever be made, Redline.
Super good movie. Super good. Those cars were really cool.
Yeah, because in I don't know if it doesn't outright say it, but Redline is very analogous to the infamous Cannonball Run.
Hmm.
The thing that provided the inspiration for Steel Ball Run in JoJo, and is one of the most infamous illegal street races, because it was a cross country race where the rule was, if you've got four wheels, you can participate.
Yep.
And the and because of that, you had a wide variety of vehicles, even fucking vans. So
Hmm.
the point is, with this kind of thing, is that there is quite literally nothing you can't do with it.
Absolutely.
And even and hell, the Mad Max PS4 game we got was pretty good. So why not mix Mad Max with Twisted Metal?
I could see that.
There was a there. I'd like to see a spiritual successor to Quarantine, which is an unholy combination of Twisted Metal and Crazy Taxi. Ross
Mhm.
did a video on it years ago, and what's to stop a racing roguelike when you DNF, that's it for that run. And a lot of the ideas that I mentioned here have been dipped into in the indie scene. I recently came across one project in development that is doing a card-based racing roguelike. There's also there's other ones that are doing they're doing ridiculous takes on the concepts with Outrun, which incidentally that's another racer that we haven't had another entry in quite a while.
Hmm.
And I think now I think the reason why I bring all of these other entries up is, again, as as much as people want to claim otherwise, and don't get me wrong, as much as I've slagged a lot of sim racing, I've still had a lot of fun with those games.
Exactly.
However, what I see is a genre that is in a standstill, in a in a place where all that it wishes to do is just the bare minimum, while everybody else in gaming is making leaps and bounds forward in both the AAA and in the indies.
Yeah.
I know it's easy to just pick on the failings of indies, but there are, or not the failings of indies, but the failings of AAA. But I do not paint the medium with a broad brush. I leave that to bad faith content creators.
You know who you are, bad faith content creators.
Mm-hmm.
You know who you are.
The kind of people who take the failings of your Redfalls or your modern day Battlefields or the like and apply that to the whole medium.
Mm-hmm.
Now I know one might say, well why don't you showcase racing games during the during the shit shows that you do. Well, I'll first off, we did showcase Redout 2 when that came around.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of them either come around in between shit shows or don't get a spotlight.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not from lack of trying on my part. But this is it's for this reason that it's a cautionary tale, and to shift away. There has been one game that's coming out in a few days, that in fact 4 days at the time of this recording, that has been a big example of people wanting that designed by gospel dogma. It's high time we talk about some of the bitch fits people have had regarding Final Fantasy 16. And there are two debates that we ended up getting dragged into because of one tweet I made as a fucking joke. A few days ago, I made a tweet on the matter. Specifically, it was basically my own version of the starter pack meme. And let me see if I can find where I put it. And a lot of people misinterpreted what I was trying to say. So, 4 days ago, I put out a tweet saying, franchises that shifted their play style and pissed off Grognard's starter pack, i.e. bitching about FF16 leaning into action because MUD tradition is hypocritical. And the entries that I used were Sakura Wars on the PS4, FF16, Dawn of War 2, and Armored Core 4. And I put in a bonus round of Persona 3. In hindsight, I also should have thrown in Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I don't know if that actually pissed off Grognards, but it's in the same pattern. Now, a lot of people tried to discredit what I was getting at by saying, "Oh, Sakura Wars just felt like a mediocre Dynasty Warriors," or Armored Core 4's mobility was too fast and floaty. That is completely irrelevant to the point I was trying to make. the point I was trying to make is that this idea of this idea of you have to adhere to a certain play style when you're doing an entry within a franchise does not hold up historically.
As we have gone on ad nauseum about here, whenever we've brought up Final Fantasy, the one thing I always continue to say is that all Final Fantasy ever does, traditionally, is innovate itself in order to elevate itself, whatever those innovations may be.
Mm-hmm.
Final Fantasy has never had a distinct and rigid story structure, character design, gameplay style, setting, musical style. None of these things have been concrete and set in stone. None of them. Final Fantasy, as Yoshi P once famously said in an interview, is good story, good gameplay, good music, good graphics, chocobos, and Moogles. Or, in a different interview, and these are things that both Monk and I have found excerpts, both from Yoshi P and from Mr. Belts and Zippers himself, Tetsuya Nomura. Both of these people have told Yoshi P and Nomura, or both of these people have been told by Sakaguchi, Hironobu Sakaguchi, one of the original creators of Final Fantasy, is that Final Fantasy doesn't have restrictions. It, for example, what was told to Yoshi P by both Sakaguchi and Kitase, who is the Final Fantasy brand manager, they say Final Fantasy is whatever the director making the latest installment thinks is the best game and the best story at the time. And what Nomura was told by Sakaguchi was, Final Fantasy doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional RPG. Mainline titles can even be novels or movies.
And I do remember some people taking hyper focusing on the movie part and saying, well, yes, but Spirits Within was absolutely horrible. Do you really want to use that as your argument?
And my counter is always Advent Children.
Which they'll also say, well, that was horrible too. They should stop making movies. Except
and then I go, well, you're free to be wrong, at least if you live in the U.S.
Except the thing is with all of these, the quality is not the focus.
Yeah, it's a hyper focus on aspects of the game that have nothing to do with the quality of the game as a whole, just something about the game that they don't like.
Mm-hmm. And if I have to use another case of where design by gospel leads, let's consider the likes of Dragon Quest. Now, don't get me wrong, I love me some Dragon Quest. However, there is a reason why it lost the Dragon Quest Day thing lost its power over the years. I'd say by the end of the SNES era, the concept of Dragon Quest Day was more or less gone.
Mm-hmm.
Now, part of it is due to the fact that they did not adapt to 3D all that well for quite a while. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the only entry in the PS1 era was 7 and a couple spin-offs.
Mm-hmm.
The only entry in the PS2 era was 8, and that was done by Level 5. Which definitely was a shot in the arm, and I'd say a very strong reintroduction. But would 8 have done as well as it did on the PS2 if it didn't have a demo of Final Fantasy 12?
I don't know. That's not something I think we can really assess.
It's hard. It's one of those things that's hard to assess, but I also can't ignore it.
Yeah.
However, Dragon Quest as a design over the years has been very, very conservative. It's dipped into into having classes or vocations in as they call it in some of the games, but it's never committed. I want to say a couple of them did back in the day, and that was it. But it's if you said that Dragon Quest is supposed to be high fantasy, I'd get into the particulars, but okay, like we're not going to see a sci-fi Dragon Quest for instance. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
I would, however, say that the bigger part of the identity of Dragon Quest is the art style of Akira Toriyama. Without him, you don't really have that identity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that being said, I'd say that adherence to sticking to what works from three onward is part of the reason that it ended up losing its luster, because so many other people within the industry and in the genre were taking their cues from Dragon Quest and doing their own things with it.
Mm-hmm.
But Dragon Quest themselves, as far as Yuji Hoри's whole crowd at Enix and later on the Enix part of Square Enix, never really adapted the model.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of Enix, some of their stuff on the PS1 was already outshining it, like say Valkyrie Profile.
Mm-hmm.
And just I'd say Tri-Ace in general. Between them and Tales Studio, the thing is, everybody was taking the Dragon Quest model, doing their own things with it, and those things were things that Dragon Quest wasn't offering. If it weren't for, would you say that there was a similar bit of stagnation for a few years when it came to Monster Hunter until World?
Mm-mm. No, Monster Hunter is innovated with every game, or with every generation, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
Monster Hunter 1 was, it set the genre. Monster Hunter 2 changed up how controls work, so they were at once both more comfortable because you're not attacking with a right stick, but less comfortable because you're on the PSP.
Mm-hmm.
Monster Hunter Tri gave us more weapon variety, more weapon animations, more monsters, different ways of hunting monsters, and also water combat, which was only good on the Wii because the Wii actually had a really good way of ascending and descending in the water.
Mm-hmm.
Monster Hunter 4 gave us the mounting system. Je suis monté, everybody.
Yeah.
And also gave us even more new weapons with new mechanics and new ways of how statuses can work against other monsters and against yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 5th gen, World and Iceborne, and technically Rise and Sunbreak, gave us a bunch of new stuff. World and Iceborne gave us the continuous maps with no loading gates. And even more control over how weapons work. Even more customization, a lot of quality of life upgrades. And
an emphasis on verticality.
Mm-hmm. Rise and Sunbreak gave us, wire bugs and the ability to fucking do way more verticality.
Mm-hmm.
In combat as well as they gave us the Palamute, because that is possibly the best addition to a Monster Hunter in a while.
Yeah,
depending on how much you like dogs.
Well, we are not David Cage, so we like dogs.
Mm-hmm. I like dogs. Yes, Brian Dishard, never change. We love you.
Mm-hmm.
We stand you in this house. But the Monster Hunter generations always innovate. Within a generation, you may see smaller changes.
such as 4th generation technically includes Cross and Double Cross, or Generations and Generations Ultimate, for those of you who got it in the West, which gave us Hunter styles and Hunter arts. That's still 4th gen. That's not 5th gen yet.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, whenever I see I suppose another example of a vocal minority within a fan base wanting a idea of what came before to be the standard, because gospel would be the people arguing up a storm about how Armored Core 6 is taking too many cues from the Souls games. From putting aside that all we have is just a few minutes. Thank you, Vati.
Mm-hmm.
But there seems to be this idea that we need to go back to the control setup of the PS2 era. I don't know about you, but I do not feel like doing crab hands again.
Well, and in the PS2 era, it wasn't even crab hands. It was, you don't attack by pressing buttons. It's all the direction of the right stick. That was cancer. Like, if there was one thing I had to criticize about the original Monster Hunter on PS2, it was that attacking with the right stick was fucking cancer.
Yeah. Like, some people think that we should bring back the lockbox in Armored Core.
Technically, we already have it. There's a soft lock and a hard lock in 6. The soft lock acts almost exactly like the lockbox did in previous Armored Core games before 4 and 4 Answer.
Yeah.
Now, Monk, I know we brought up Final Fantasy 16 at the beginning of all this, and I want to cover a couple things regarding design by gospel, and how for Final Fantasy 16 it's a really good thing they didn't. There are people on one of the more popular websites for video games, or at least it was at one point, Game FAQs, in the Final Fantasy 16 boards, who post things like this. I really feel like I'm literally the only person on Earth who got into FF years ago, over 20 years ago, because of it being turn-based. And if years ago, if it was like Devil May Cry, I never would have gotten into the series. I played the original Devil May Cry around 20 years ago on PS2. And you haven't played any Devil May Cry since, have you? It's evolved a lot. Maybe not exactly 20 years, but around there. And I used cheats because I couldn't stand the gameplay. So get good. Only because some of the music was cool and the visuals. I didn't even beat the game because after a while it bored me. It bored you because you were cheating. You didn't earn your way through the game, so of course you got fucking bored because nothing challenged you. And then when you didn't have your cheats, you were too challenged. Maybe you should just admit it's not for you. And then they say this. Square Enix doesn't even care that they are alienating even just one person. The series is supposed to be turn-based. No, it's not. And excluding the FF7 Remake Trilogy with Classic Mode, I won't be playing any other FFs unless they return to turn-based. If there is an FF9 remake and they make the mistake of not having it in traditional gameplay, I'll just have to use cheats, sadly, because of the gameplay. So, to this person, Final Fantasy is a game series no longer for you, because it's not the game's fault that it's evolving. It's your fault that you're not. But the reason, Monk, that I love that they didn't bow to the Grogs, besides the fact that the combat looks fucking amazing. Oh wait, no, it's exactly because of the fact that the combat looks fucking amazing, and the story is phenomenal, and the voice acting is actually terrific, and you can pet the fucking dog, which is something not even fucking The Legend of Zelda has. I had to make that joke because people are comparing the two as if they're comparable. So, a little while ago, we heard from Yoshi P that pre-orders in Japan aren't doing well.
and that pre-orders for Final Fantasy 16 in general aren't doing well. I am proud to announce that a topic opened just 4 hours ago on Game FAQs. Pre-orders in Japan for Final Fantasy 16 seem to be skyrocketing.
So
And-
so it looks like that little quote mine is dead.
Well, let's put it this way. Once we hit around... So, pre-orders were very low starting around February this year. They climbed a little bit between March, April, and May, going to about, looks like... I don't know if this is in hundreds or thousands, it just has it marked as 40 pre-orders at around May. And as we get to June, it climbs to 80, which is still a big climb. That's a doubling. And then from June to now, it's up at 160. It doubled again in less than a month. And it jumped from 120 to 160 in the last few days. Meaning the demo has done its job. And if you look at the Amazon pre-orders and sales numbers for Final Fantasy 16, currently, according to Amazon, Final Fantasy 16 just for PS5, because right now it's a timed PS5 exclusive, kind of a miss on Square Enix's part, but I guess they're still changed to Sony for some reason. Number 2 best-selling game in pre-order in the USA. Number 1 in Japan. Now, the Japanese market being what it is for consoles, you can't say that it's going to affect sales that much, but from what we saw, it's been spiking a lot. But number 2 in the US, that's a big one. So, once again, to all of you motherfuckers bitching, whining, and complaining that Final Fantasy 16 is bad because it's not turn-based, eat shit. Admit that you can't evolve as the games evolve, and that Final Fantasy just isn't a series for you anymore.
Here is the thing that always frustrates me with this kind of thinking. And I had talked about this in the past, but I think it's important to revisit. There is a line of thinking that manages to annoy me, and I couldn't for the longest time I couldn't figure out why it annoyed me. The line of this would be a perfect game if it didn't have the name. And the example I remember using, and this was years ago, so I don't remember what was said, was Chrono Cross. That Chrono Cross would be a perfect game if it didn't if it wasn't a sequel to Chrono Trigger. And
I've heard that one before.
I remember telling you at the time that it annoyed me, and I think the reason it annoys me, you can probably come up with some other reasons why it might annoy me, because you and I think very similarly.
Mm-hmm.
Is the fact that when you're saying that kind of thing, what you're basically telling me is that designers should not try because they're in a franchise and expectations.
Which is funny because Chrono Cross being a sequel to Chrono Trigger, which wasn't a franchise to begin with, can't really count Radical Dreamers because it was kind of a thing but kind of not a thing, and then it never came to the US until the Chrono Cross re-release.
Mm-hmm.
But trying to say that it shouldn't have been named part of the Chrono series, which, again, was not a series until there was a second game. It was just Chrono Trigger, a standalone title. And then Chrono Cross comes out, and people are like, oh, it's a sequel to Chrono Trigger. Or connected to Chrono Trigger some way. Technically, it's a sequel, yes. Spoilers for a game that's so old that most of you were probably not born yet. But then saying, oh, it should have been associated with Chrono. If it hadn't been associated with Chrono, you never would have fucking bought it!
Mm-hmm.
You relied on that understanding of what Chrono Trigger was, and you saw how it was connected, and you liked it, and then you were like, but it kind of fell short in places, so maybe it shouldn't have been Chrono after all. Not every game is perfect, and trying to think that it is fucking ludicrous. And the biggest thing about that, the one that really fucking just gets me going, is this idea that innovation cannot happen unless it is in a way a player, because this is only, like, a lot of these people who are complaining, they're complaining on a personal level. They don't give a shit about everybody else bitching. It's their bitching that they care about. Unless the game innovates in a way that you like, it's a bad innovation and shouldn't have happened. I know that.
I remember when there was a massive controversy about the Renbu system in Dynasty Warriors.
Mm-hmm.
Which I'm not going to sit here and defend, but the same people who say that also say that Dynasty Warriors ends up being the same game every time there's a new installment. Even though you look at the games over the years, and that's not exactly true.
Mm-hmm. The point I wanted to get across with my last thing was, I have spoken out against the I guess the best way to say it is narrative from the gaming non-journalists, for lack of a better term. They're not journalists. They have no journalistic ethics.
I have better journalistic ethics.
Mm-hmm. I won't call you a journalist, though. That's too insulting.
Mm-hmm.
By these harpies, I guess is the best way to put it, is that gamers are entitled. And I've spoken out against that, not saying that gamers aren't entitled, but saying that gamers do have a right to input on a thing that they have purchased. Our money is what allows games to be made. And I acknowledge that. But at some point, there's a difference between fair and balanced critique, such as the critique of the ending of Mass Effect 3. Yes, even the extended cut ending. There's still too much to critique there.
Yeah, we've covered that.
Mm-hmm. Or critique of, I don't know, what's another thing we've critiqued? There's so much I can pick from. I'll just leave it with that because you get the idea, people. But there's fair and balanced critique that we gamers are entitled to make because we purchased the product and it did not live up to the standards that the developers promised. They said, this is what this product is going to have. And we get that product and it does not have those things. That is a place where we are entitled to go, yo, we gave you money for this, and you fucked it up, and we didn't even get what you said we were getting. Fix it. This is fucking bullshit. And we have the right to do that. And it's reasonable and valid. It is logically sound. But that's not what's happening in this case. What's happening is that developers came out and said, this is how this game is going to be. And it's a game in a series, or it's a game that's from a developer that you've expected a certain type of game from, or anything of that nature, and it's different. And it's different in a way that you personally don't like, and you're like, no, that's bad, because it's not how it used to be, and I don't like it. That's not reasonable. That's not valid. That's not logically sound. It's emotionally valid for that single person. I'll admit that. But I'm going to tell you, the developers get to make the games they want to make. Fuck you.
And what always frustrates me when it comes to this is, let's go with the turn-based thing. Since everybody seems to think that that turn-based is the smart man's kind of game, and you can't have strategy in real-time action or some kind of shit like that.
Okay.
There are no shortage of turn-based games that one can go to. Yet instead of doing that, you're sitting here like a dog on a nail over this one entry. And if I'm being honest, I've been hearing about how Final Fantasy is dying or dead for about 20 years now. Because I remember hearing that regarding 8. I heard it regarding 9. I heard it regarding 10. I've heard it regarding the idea of 11 being an online game. I've heard it regarding 12. I've heard it regarding the 13 era. I've heard it regarding 15. I've heard it regarding every spin-off that came out around in that period of time.
Man, I remember when I heard it about Crystal Chronicles, I was like, what the fuck are you on?
I treat it with the same level of respect I do the milking argument that I hear whenever there's, say, a spin-off of a Persona game.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of these cases, yes, it is people trying to justify their emotional state. But if someone but the thing is, there, as I mentioned before, there's already stuff like Octopath Traveler that is going to stick to turn-based because its playstyle demands it. There's going to be stuff like Deal Field Chronicle or Triangle Strategy or even not Extella. What am I saying? The point is
Harvestella.
Harvestella, which honestly feels like Final Fantasy meets Harvest Moon in a lot of places. There's things like Battle Chasers Night War, which is doing its own thing with the turn-based concept. Even the League of Legends spin-off, The Ruined King, which is doing its own spin and trying to integrate the lane mechanic that's in League into a turn-based RPG. Those kind of things are out there.
Mm-hmm. The reason people are bitching about these specific entries is because, as I said, justifying their emotional response, Final Fantasy is somehow core to their identity as a person. Is the intimation that I get from all of this? It's like, there's a reason I keep saying, just admit Final Fantasy is not a series for you anymore.
If you do that, we'd be perfectly fine. But here's the thing when it comes to this sort of thing. First off, I have repeatedly said that nostalgia is a sweet poison, and it's a poison that is consumed by hypocrites. Because we've all seen the case of somebody going going on about how they're sick of this obsession with remakes, and yet they keep talking about things they'd like to see remade.
Mm-hmm.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-remake or something like that, but I've always been of the mindset of use remakes as an opportunity to polish the dirty diamonds.
Mm-hmm.
But what I take from a lot of this is wanting to focus more on the popular name. This is the reason. I think this is as good a time as any to explain why we have the mantra "games, not names."
Okay,
because that's core to this.
Yeah, we've been through it a couple times before, but always good to remind everybody. Games, not names is shorthand for we care about the content of the game. Its gameplay, its story, its music, all of those things that come together to make the game what it is, and whether those are good or not. Not the name on the game cartridge, not the name of the developer, none of it. The names, trying to purchase something based on the name is as asinine as purchasing brand designer clothing just because it's brand designer clothing. You want to look at the quality of what you are purchasing. And so, strip away the Final Fantasy name from Final Fantasy 16. Name it, take away the name. Go play the demo. The music is phenomenal. The gameplay is tight and extremely enjoyable. The story and the characters are compelling. And the visuals are extremely beautiful and dynamic. These are things that are good quality. And then remember that it's Final Fantasy. And you go, okay, this game is good and happens to be Final Fantasy, making it a good Final Fantasy game. But the name Final Fantasy is a descriptor of pedigree to some, and that's the issue we have. That's part of pedigree is one of the things that, while I didn't say it exactly as pedigree when explaining Design by Gospel, is one of the big factors that causes people to design by gospel is pedigree, that tradition for tradition's sake.
Mm-hmm.
Strip away a name, go into a game and experience it. If the experience is good without the baggage of whatever name, whether that's a developer's name or a title from something, maybe it's a series, and you enjoy the experience is good, then it is a good game. And that is all we care about. The game. Games, not names. Mm-hmm. Games, not names.
And the big reason that I bring up this concept is we have had issue with people who put far too much faith in the names of franchises, as if those are the only games that matter when it comes to the state of gaming. And in that same, because those are, even though they will lament about how there's certain things that are lacking in a given game entry from that franchise, and then it's pointed out that there are games outside of that are doing exactly that, and those games are being dismissed. What that mindset tells me is that you care more about the name than actual gaming. Hence why I started using the phrase "games, not names." Because I will use let's use Metroidvanias as one example. Now, yes, a lot of people made a big deal about Bloodstained, but even if Bloodstained wasn't made by Iga, I still think it would have been a success. Especially since there already was, and there still is, a very competitive amount of Metroidvania-like games.
Mm-hmm.
that are each doing their own thing. Hollow Knight was already around for a good amount of time, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course you have stuff like Blasphemous, which is definitely doing its own thing, even if some of my colleagues find it a bit too violent for their takes.
I mean, that's personal sensibilities, and we can't really admonish them on that. But
it is,
all I can say is I'm sorry you miss out on a good game.
Yeah, but it is still it, and there can be a good amount of argument about whether or not it is a Souls-like or a Metroidvania. I lean more towards it being a Metroidvania.
No, it's absolutely a Metroidvania. You can explore in any direction that you want, so long as you know what you're doing. There are segment skips and everything, just like in Metroidvanias in Blasphemous. And also, I would argue that it's an action Metroidvania with Souls-like tendencies, at least in some respects.
Which does bring me to another thing. I've talked about this in the past, but genre is not a ghettoized category.
Yeah, genres are not you hit one thing with a genre and that's that. You can use a genre to describe the primary conceit of the game. Like if we say Metroidvania, there's going to be a focus on exploration and upgrades contributing to exploration, whether that's in the style of the original Igavania of Symphony of the Night, or whether that's in the style of Super Metroid, or any of that particular respect, or if it's in the style of some of the 3D Metroidvanias that have existed. But there's still going to be other things in that gameplay loop that aren't that primary conceit and are overlaps from other genres. No genre is an island. It's more like an archipelago with bridges connecting each one.
Yeah. And I kind of went over this when I talked about the JRPG issue. But going further into the matter, um, the I let's also not forget that with doing a new entry in any long running series, or even a new entry in a genre, it is as much about bringing new people into it as much as it is pleasing the folk who are already there. And if you were to do this whole we do turn based and nothing else, and do it exactly the same as it was in say 6, you would ultimately end up with a worse experience. And I'm using 6, but this could apply to any entry. The point is that in doing that, all it's doing is you're not bringing anybody into it. I remember somebody saying once that they couldn't understand why FF13 sucks became a hot take in some communities about and then ranted on about how bad the game is. Putting aside the fact that you could always just ask the people who like it why they like it. It's not that hard. And I'm not even saying that I'm a massive fan of FF13. I enjoy parts of it, and I appreciate that it was the game that made me step up how I review games. But I'm not gonna say that it's a masterpiece or something like that. But what I am aware of is that for a whole generation of people, that was their entry point. I know some of you might say that's a shit entry point. Do not piss on another man's parade. I don't care what their entry point was, as long as their entry point was something and they stuck around.
There's a really old proverb that describes this situation. Some that I'm sure a lot of people out there have heard and don't understand how it's actually supposed to be applied, but applying it here is actually correct. One man's trash is another man's treasure.
And to that end, I firmly believe that in the case of both Final Fantasy 16 and Armored Core 6, and I even said this about Ace Combat 6 at one point, this is going to be someone's entry point. And much like how every comic is someone's first, the same can apply in these kind of situations. So, for some people, this is going to be the game that got them into Final Fantasy or Armored Core, respectively. And we're already, in the case of Armored Core 6, we're already starting to see the effects before the game even comes out, because I've been getting more and more AC-based content on my feed, and there's a whole bunch of folk who have been talking to me and other people about where to get into the franchise. I usually tell them the routes. Although I usually say if you're gonna be going if you're gonna be going with a straight disc, um, be prepared for emptying your wallet.
Ugh, my
Because
wallet cries at me.
I'm just saying, grabbing old PS2 games isn't gonna come cheap.
Everybody knows that old song, "While My Guitar Gently Weeps." I'm going to modify it to "While My Billfold Gently Weeps."
But the point is that within within this within this vastness, this idea that there's a certain way that things have to be done, I will always argue that ends up causing more harm to game design than any help. Familiarity can certainly bring people in, but familiarity breeds contempt. And to bring it back to sim racing, this is the reason why I've been so harsh on the state of racing games, because there's still so much that can be done within the medium, and so much that is being done. But if we keep celebrating the bare minimum, then design by gospel is all that's going to be left.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have yet another game that has you racing around the green hell for the umpteenth time with no changes from what came before. And if you want to see where that and I do not want to see where that ends, because I know it'd be tempting to say that that's the exact same thing that happens with sports games, except sports games have the restriction of having to rely upon the current roster. Racing games don't really have that issue. You'll notice that most of the ones I talked about tonight, they don't they don't they don't have the official license of any racing game, of any racing format.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, all of them are essentially their own thing.
Yeah.
And hell, for the longest time, Gran Turismo didn't even try and replicate any real tracks. I'm pretty sure it still doesn't. And in not doing that, you can open up designers' creativity to utilize the mechanics that they have to create an experience that's wholly unique.
Yes.
I've seen Monaco, I've seen the Nürburgring, I've seen Le Mans. I know how these tracks work. However, there's a reason why Rainbow Road lives rent free in people's heads. Uh, there's and that applies to several other racing games and particular tracks that are standouts. Much in the same way that, say, Midship is a fan favorite in Halo.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or I suppose a better example I could use is Blood Gulch.
Mm-hmm.
The instead the point with all of this is, it's important to, yes, design, bad design needs to be held accountable, but bad advice also needs to be bad advice and bad expectations also need to be held accountable. Not every expectation is of equal value. And to be honest, the final example of design by gospel creating stagnation. I know some people are going to get on me about this, but the OSR movement. You'll notice, if you look back at the catalog of games that I've covered, there's only a handful of quote-unquote old school games that I've reviewed. There's a very simple reason for this. A lot of the how much of if unless you're somebody who is a veteran of old school D&D, how much is there that's truly different from that outside perspective, from old school essentials to dungeon crawl classics to Osric? I am well aware that there are significant differences between all three of those entries. But unless you're within that circle, how could you even tell?
You really can't, because you just don't have that insider look.
And because of the fact that it almost requires that, a lot of the people who end up jumping on those games are the same batch of people every single time.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it doesn't exactly help that a lot of them are trying desperately to pretend it's 1978 all the damn time. Instead of using the format of what came out in 1978 and doing something unique with it. This is the reason why I speak so highly of Adventurer Conqueror King's system, because that's exactly what it does. And the same thing can kind of apply to Ascendant, which of course is acting as a fusion between Marvel Phase Rip and DC Heroes. But it's doubling down on having a unified physics system within its gameplay. That is something that there isn't really a whole lot of people doing. And yeah, there was Blood of Heroes, which was DC Heroes in all but name, but Blood of Heroes hasn't seen a release in decades. What the racing genre needs, and especially in sim racing, is I won't say a brand spanking new experience, but an emphasis to a focus on creating an experience that's all its own, instead of one that is meant to be like what came before. And if you want even more stagnation than what supposedly is happening in the video game sphere, then that's the way you're going to get it. With any final thoughts on your end regarding the whole design by gospel thing?
If we had design by gospel all the time as something that was just accepted, there are a myriad of games that are popular and beloved for their quality and experience that we never would have gotten, including some we've mentioned here, such as Monster Hunter.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to see new experiences instead of constantly chasing the past. So when it comes to chasing the past, I saw that a lot when it came to why I stopped watching Junior Land, as we've come to call it.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, we're in a situation where there's plenty of opportunities to find new experiences, which is the reason I'm so harsh, because there is less and less excuse. And I'm going to continue being harsh until someone forces me to stop at gunpoint. At which point I'll say, "Pull the trigger, motherfucker, and stop bullshitting me." But that is going to do it for this particular episode. We will be back here tomorrow for the Parliament of Geeks, and asking how big is your sentence.
My sentence is so long, I can't even pronounce it.
On Tuesday, I will hopefully be interviewing Haunted Table on their upcoming RPG Triangle Agency. Which, if it sounds like that's going to be leaning into stuff like Control or SCP, yeah, it is. Just run by dice goblins. Um, on on Tuesday, on the 21st, I will, and keep in mind all this is subject to change. I will be interviewing Michael Rookhard for his diesel punk airship fueled 5e campaign setting called Galefire.
Mm-hmm.
On Thursday, Monarch and I will be going through the quick start of Xenoscape. That'll be his first one. That'll be his first one shot in the usual format. No Valley of the Judged on Friday. We will be back here on Sunday with the next iteration of GeekWatch. So, as a certain man would say, please look forward to it. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra, I am your gaming monk, and join the watch.